and we are at the Mishnah. So we got to a good place to start, which is, remember, we're continuing our discussion of chalitza and the specifics. If you recall, the Torah seems to have three specific details about chalitza. Well, maybe more than three, four, I guess. We'll discuss them. But the first is you got to take off the shoe, right? So the woman wears the shoe, and we discussed the shoe in great detail. And the man who's doing chalitza takes off the shoe, or he's chaltza na'alo. That's what chalitza literally means, right? Then she spits. We'll talk about the rikika. And then he says something, and they say something. She says something, right? She says, me'en yavmi, that my Yevamot doesn't want to take me. And then the people say, sorry?
Doesn't this take place before she spits?
Yes. Sorry, that wasn't going in order. Correct. But so these are all the parts. So she makes this thing, me'en yavmi, and he says, I can't take her. And then, of course, they do that's the whole process. So we're going to discuss all those details. Till now, we've mainly been discussing the actual shoe and all those details. Today's Mishnah continues. Mishnah says, Chaltza b'layla. Let's say you do chalitza at night. Chalitza to kshera. Says the Mishnah, it's okay. It's okay to do it. Of course, usually when we say kshera, it implies begrudgingly. We'd rather you do it during the day, but b'diavad, it's kosher at night. Rabbi Elazar posel. Rabbi Elazar disagrees. He says that doesn't count. You have to do it again. It doesn't count. They could leave them the next day, potentially. Continues the Mishnah. Bismol, if you do chalitza on the left, now we think this means, we're going to see actually, we think this means the left foot, right? Not the left hand of the person taking off the shoe, but the left foot. Chalitzato psula, that doesn't count. You need to do the right foot. But Rebbe Lazar, machshir, and here Rebbe Lazar, who passed that night, says it's kosher if you do the left foot. We'll see in the Gemara where this machloket is. Says the Gemara, we assume, why would someone say you could do chalitza at night or not do chalitza at night? Of course, the question would be, how do you think of chalitza? Is it a court issue, a judgment, in which case, remember, court, we'll see, but court judgments have to be done during the day. Or is it just, an action, like you're doing any kind of regular transaction, which of course you can sell your field at night, you can do regular transactions. So maybe they're arguing about that detail. The Mar Savar, that one Tanakama holds, Rebbe Lazar holds, makshinin rivim linigaim, that you make a hekesh, you compare riv, which is judgment, right? This kind of question of beit din, to nigaim. Now, remember, with nigaim, there's a very specific detail that with looking at Sarat, which is curious, where we talked about Sarat yesterday too.
It be done during the day.
But Sarat has to be done during the day, probably because the Kohen has to see it, right? Remember, they're not allowed to see it with a candle, with light. You have to rely on natural light. So just like nigaim are during the day, so rivim, all judgment, all things that require a beit din have to be during the day. That's one opinion. So therefore, chalitza would need to be during the day. Umar Savar and Tanakama holds lo makshin rivim l'nigayim. Then in fact you don't compare them. Then that maybe, that's why we're bringing this, all judgment can be done at night. Unlike what I said earlier, that beit din can meet at night. It says more lo. That's not the machloket in the Mishnah. The Kuli Alma, everybody agrees that lo makshin rivim l'nigayim. You don't compare rivim l'nigayim, and even though by tzarat the Kohen can only work during the day, by din beit din can work even at night. How do I know that? Because if you had done that, afilu gemar din b'layla namila, you couldn't even finish a din at night. Now, we learned in Sanhedrin, or we will learn in Sanhedrin, that there's a rule that Beit Din can only start a din during the day, but once they start negotiations and discussion, deliberations, they can finish at night, right? But if it was true that you compared din to nigayim, you couldn't even finish at night because you can't do any part of it at night. So clearly, all the Tanaim hold, not clearly, but we're saying that you can do din at night if you're finishing, you can't start. But the question really about chalitza is Mar Savar chalitza kitchilat din, Damya. One Tana holds, the Tana Rabbi Elazar holds that chalitza is like beginning the din. It's like the starting of a new case. And basically the case is divorce and, appointment of assets and giving out the ketubah. And Mar Savar chalitza kigmar din Damya. And the other Tanakama holds it's like finishing a din, meaning something's already started, I guess, by the person dying and by the whole procedure. And the chalitza is the end of that. And so once it's already started during the day, you can finish it even at night. And that's why you can do chalitza at night. So that's the Mishnah. Now, says the
So
Gemara.
there's no concept about like finishing the next day, for example.
So there's a question of halanat din, right? We don't like to keep a din overnight. So we actually, at least in Sanhedrin, we discussed we prefer not to go to the next day. Sometimes you had to, right? If they didn't have a consensus, you'd have to keep going. But they tried very, very hard to finish things quickly.
Okay.
Which, unfortunately, I think courts today are not known for. But that was a big attempt. Continues the Gemara, interesting story. There was a person named Rabba Barchia Kutusva. Rabba Barchia, I think Kutusva is a place, right? Russia's
Yep. Mm-hmm.
The Rabba Barchia from this place Kutusva, do they say any idea where Kutusva is or somewhere in Persia?
Oh, my father told me before, but I forgot.
Interesting.
I think
Okay.
in Persia, I think.
That makes
something like that.
With Babylonians, right? But somewhere.
Yeah.
So Rabba Barchia, Avad Uvda Bimok, Ubiyichidi Ubelayla. He did a chalitza where he used 3 questionable details. One is he used a mok. Mok is something we discussed yesterday in the list of things you're not supposed to, you can use. Mok I translated as felt yesterday. So, pressed wool or whatever you make felt out of. I think that's what it is. Right? So it's a shoe that it's basically very, it's protective. There's no leather involved, but it is very thick basically. And it's magin, unlike the regular cloth, which we said wasn't good, like the socks. But mok is okay, so it's felt. He did a chalitza with a shoe that was made out of felt, and he did it by himself. Remember the first mission in our parak said that you're supposed to do 3 people for chalitza. It's okay if you do 1. And he did it at night. So he really relied on all these sort of questionable things. And Shmuel said, wow, this guy must be great, sarcastically. Kama Rav Guvrai Da'avik Yechida. What a great person he is that he's relying on Yechida, meaning he's relying on every, outlandish, not outlandish, but outsider opinion. And he was criticizing him. Like, why do things in such a way that may be technically okay, but you're relying on all these different, I won't say kulas, because it's not a kula, but all these individual opinions. Doesn't matter, 1 second. Why is Shmuel so angry? My kasha, what's Shmuel upset about? Imok, if he's upset that he used felt, what do you mean? We had a braita yesterday, which just said felt's okay. There was no argument. There was no yichida, right? We stama tanya, we learned that stam in the braita yesterday, that mok is okay. There's no one suggested that mok is b'diavad, or it's a machloket. In Laila, the night, the same thing. Stama tanya. Our Mishnah says, right? We just read our Mishnah, chalitza b'layla, chalitza tok sheira. So it's true, Rebbe Lazar argues, but the Tanakama, who usually paskin like, says it's okay. So it's not, it's not such a far-fetched thing to paskin like the Tanakama. In fact, that's the way we usually do it. And El Yechidi Kakasha, the question he had was, how can you do it by yourself? Why don't you bring in other dayanim with you or other individuals with you, right? Because Heichi Abed B'Yechidi, right? How did he do it? B'Yechidi, the Yechida Ketanila, it's not, our Mishnah said, right? That's a Yechida opinion that you can do it by yourself. Because our Mishnah said, if you do chalitza, it's a little later today, 2 or 3, meaning you have more than 1 person, but nimtza echad mehem karov or pasul, if you find that one of the dayanim is a karov or pasul, because presumably they're related to each other or related to the person involved, then chalitzato psula. The Mishnah is going to say later that the chalitza is pasul because you don't have enough dayanim. However, there's a dat yechida, Reb Shimon, for Reb Yochanan, Hasan lo machshirim, right? And so, therefore, it's a dat yechida. And in fact, the Mishnah is going to say, there was a case once, a very difficult case, where the brother, was in jail, right? And they weren't going to let him out of jail. There was no furloughs then. So he was in jail, and the problem was that, her husband died. Her husband's, brother, no good brother, is sitting in prison for 20 years. She's now an aguna, basically, because she needs to get chalitza from the husband's brother. How's she going to do that? So they found some way that they smuggled her into the prison with a shoe, right? And, well, maybe he had a shoe. They smuggled her into prison. He did chalitza, beino leveina. There was no opportunity to have a beit din, but they did it. And what they say, right? There was a maaseh. Sorry, be'echad shechalatz beino leveina bebeit ha'asurim uba maaseh lefnei Rabbi Akiva v'hichshir, and they were machshir, right? So b'diavad, basically, not b'diavad, Rabbi Akiva said it's okay. However, some people take this out because it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I'm going to read it. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Yumi, Amar Rav Nachman, ein halachak oto azug. That we don't pass them like that zug, and that's why Shmuel was angry. that basically he was relying on this dat yichida that you can do chalitza by yourself, which Rabbi Akiva said was okay, but Rabbi Akiva was a dat yachid, and we paskin not like that, and that's why Shmuel was upset. Or Ibai Dema, or some would say Kula Nami Yichida Katani, that in fact all three of the rules were Yichida, because the Tanya Reb Yishmael Reb Yossi, Ani Ra'iti et Reb Yishmael ben Elisha, says Reb Yishmael Reb Yossi, Tana, I saw Reb Yishmael ben Elisha shechalatz b'mok b'yichidi u'belayla. I in fact saw that Reb Yishmael ben Elisha did the exact same thing. He was chalatz b'mok b'yichidi u'belayla. Now, Tosis points out that this doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? Because what are you proving from here, right? That, well, Tosis has a different problem. Tosis is bothered by the fact that Rabbi Yishmael ben Reb Yossi, who was all the way, remember, Rabbi Yossi was a contemporary of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So Rabbi Yishmael ben Reb Yossi was like the last generation of Tanaim. And Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha was a very, very early Tana, right? And so it's very hard to understand how they could have seen them do this. So Tosis is bothered by the whole story, and I think he changes the names. He says it's a different person. So anyways, but the question is, what did they see from this? So you'd have to understand that he saw him do it, but the fact that he did it by himself was sort of a dat yachid. He was an outlier, right? He was a renegade who did this. And so relying on this kind of thing is considered to be inappropriate, and that's why Shmuel got angry that he relied on this.
The reason he probably did it at night is because he was using a moke, and he was doing it at night, and he knew that was.
Well, that's what Shmuel was upset about. Exactly.
That's why he did it by himself.
Could be, but that's exactly what Shmuel's. I agree with you. But that's Shmuel saying that. This guy thinks he's so great he can make the rules up by himself, basically. Right?
Right.
And he's relying. There are opinions. He's not making it up, but he is relying on sort of outlier opinions.
Right. So I was looking up this town, Ctesifon.
Yeah.
So it's near Baghdad, 35 kilometers on the Tigris.
Okay, that makes sense. Continue the Mishnah. If you do it bismol, we said in the first part of the Mishnah said at night, machloket, and bismol is the opposite machloket, right? The Tanakama said not kosher, and Rebbe Elazar said kosher. Says the Gemara, my time in the Rabbanan. Why did the Rabbanan say it's pasul if you do chalitza with the left foot? Amar Ula, because yalfinan regel mi mitzorah. We learn out from the Mitzorah. Again, it's the third time. We're ready today. We've seen comparing it to Mitzorah, or yesterday and tonight. That by Mitzorah, of course, it talks about putting the blood, right, on the foot of the toe, the big toe of the Mitzorah. And Mala Halan Dimin, just like there, we know it must be the right foot, as the Torah says that. Afkan Dimin, here too, it has to be the right foot. Just like by Mitzorah, the Torah says, and raglah yimanit, right? It says it specifically. So too, by other cases where it talks about foot, it doesn't say which foot, we understand it to mean the right foot, according to the Tanakh. Okay? Rebbe Lazar, he says, Lo yalfin regel mi mitzorah. I'm asked, what's the question? Does Rebbe Lazar not learn regel mi mitzorah? But Tanya, we learn. Rebbe Lazar omer, minayin l'ritziyah shehi ozen hayimanit. How do you know that you do ritziyah? Remember, ritziyah is when you make the slave, right? He decides he wants to continue. So Matzeyah does know, right? You make a mark in the ear. Says Rebbe Elazar, how do you know it's in the right ear? Because Nemerkan Ozen, because by Ritziyah, by the slave it says Ozen. But Nemer Lahalan by Mitzorah Ozen. Ma Lahalan, right? We also put the blood on the Ozen Hayimanit. Ma Lahalan Yamin, Afkan Yamin. So you see that Rebbe Elazar does compare by from Mitzorah Ozen to Ozen. So why wouldn't he compare Regel to Regel? You're right. You have to switch it around. But when we said Rebbe Elazar was one who was machshir, it's wrong. The Tanakhama said it was okay because he doesn't learn regel from Mitzorah. And Rebbe Elazar says it's possible because you have to do the right foot. Rava says the olam lo tepet. No. I would not switch it around. Just because you compare one does not mean you compare the other. You cannot compare everything. You can't use that as a model because ozen mufni. The word ozen is extra. And Rashi points out that it's not that's extra by itself, it's extra on both sides, because it says it a second time by each thing, by both Mitzorah and by the Eved. And regel lo mufni. When it says regel twice, it says it is twice by Mitzorah, but it's not twice by what's it called? By chalitza, and therefore it's not mufne mishnei tzadim. and therefore you can't necessarily learn it. It's not extra on both sides. Mufni, my says, well, it's true that if it's not extra, it's a weaker comparison, but you still can compare things. You just can ask questions on it, right? Says, why wouldn't you compare regel to regel? Says, well, because I would say that there's a big difference. Mitzorah is a very complicated ceremony. You need to have a certain kind of tree, you need to have the grass, you need to have the string. So it could very well be that with Mitzorah, we're very fastidious. You have to have a very specific process, including the right foot. But by Chalitza, where there's not really a lot of other details, maybe they don't care, and the Torah doesn't care. And so, sure, if it was extra, you would compare. I mean, if the word regel was extra by Mitzorah and extra by Chalitza, then you would compare them. But since it's only extra on one side, you can compare them, but then you could point out differences. And once you point out differences, you no longer learn the halacha from one to the other. And that's why, according to that opinion, Mitzorah, Chalitza can be done even on the left foot.
Why don't they just say, if the Torah says Yeminit by the Mitzorah, and it doesn't say Yeminit by Chalitza, well, that shows that it could be done in either one, because if it had to be on the right, it would have said it.
It's a good question.
You know what? Isn't that a classic Gemara thing?
It is a classic thing. I think that the point here is that this is extra, right? So the question is, when do you say that you learn? So remember, a hekesh relies to some extent on tradition, whether we have a tradition that these things are comparable. Right? The question is, when do you look at something as an exception, or when do you look at something as the rule?
Okay.
Right? And so some of it depends on whether it's extra. Right? So if it's extra, you could. I agree with you 100%. We say that all the time. And when the Torah, wants to teach you the right foot, it says the right foot. The fact that it just says the foot means just the foot.
Right.
But you see that we are learning for the ear. Rabbi Lazar is learning from the ear that the ear of the Mitzorah is a prototypical ear. It's a right ear. And that's why we're asking the question. And we're saying that according to Rabbi Lazar, even so, if it's not extra, you can ask this question. Continues the Gemara, the next Mishnah, Chotza v'rakika avalo kara. Remember, there's basically three parts to it, as we said. Chalitza, which is taking off the shoe, Rikika, the spitting, and the Kriya, which is why I was talking in that order, because the Mishnah does, but Miriam's correct about the order not being correct, right? But if, let's say, the woman she takes off the shoe and she spits, but she doesn't read the psukim, right? She doesn't say, or just say what she's supposed to say, which is, my Yevamot does not want to take me, right? The Torah speaks out what she's supposed to say. Says the Mishnah, Chalitzata kshera, it's okay, it's enough. So even though you're supposed to do it, it's not ma'akev. So she did the action, she didn't say the words, it's a chalitza. But if kar'a v'rakika, let's say she does the kri'ah, she reads the words, or she says the words, and she spits, avalo chaltza, but she doesn't take off his shoe, then chalitza to psula, then it's not a chalitza. And if she's chaltza v'kar'a, she takes off the shoe and she reads avalo rakika, but she doesn't spit, then it's a machloket. Rabbi Lazar Omer, or something like Rabbi Eliezer, chalitzato psula, then it's pasul, and therefore if you don't spit, if you don't spit, you're not chalitz. And Rabbi Akiva Omer chalitzato kshera. Rabbi Akiva says it's kshera. Why? What's the basis for the machlok? Omer le Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar said to Rabbi Akiva, I don't get it. It says in the pasul, kacha ye'aseh leish, right? That this is how you do it. And remember, kacha always means exactly like this. Kacha means like this. So, whenever we say kacha, it implies ikuva. Kol davar shehu ma'aseh ma'akev. Anything that's an action, says Rabbi Elazar, meaning is ma'akev. What's an action? Words are not considered to be an action, interestingly, right? So the action is considered to be either taking off the shoe, chalitza, or spitting. But actually saying the words is not ma'akev. So I maintain, says Rabbi Lazar, from the word kacha ye'aseh, that the action has to be done exactly the way the Torah spells it out. And if you don't do both the spitting and the chalitza of the shoe, it's ma'akev the chalitza. The words are not ma'akev. You're supposed to do them, but they're not ma'akev. Amar le Rabbi Akiva. Said Rabbi Akiva back to Rabbi Lazar, Misham Ra'aya, you're going to prove to me from that pasuk that you have to do both the spitting and the taking off the shoe. It says, Kacha ye'aseh le'ish. This is what you do to the man, right? Meaning, Kol davar shu ma'aseh be'ish. Only actions that involve, that you're involving the man, which is taking off the shoe. But spitting in front of him by the woman, he doesn't do anything. He's passive in that. And so therefore, the only ma'aseh that is ma'akev, says Rabbi Akiva, is ma'aseh that is done with the man, which is involving him, meaning taking off the shoe. So according to Rabbi Akiva, the only act of chalitza that's ma'akev is taking off the shoe. Of course, the other parts are supposed to be done. The Torah talks about them. But you would be chalutza even if you didn't do that, according to Rabbi Akiva. Okay? That's the first part of the Mishnah. The second part of the Mishnah, which is a little bit connected, is talks about achirish. Now, chirish, again, we talk about this all the time. A chirish literally means a deaf person. But the Mishnah always assumes, or makes the assumption, that a deaf person is also mute, right? That they, because they can't hear, they can't learn to speak. And that we also, now this gets a little tricky, we generally assume that a chirish does not have intelligence, right? That they're similar to a shota. Now, we're going to discuss this, but it's not always the case that we assume that. It's certainly not all the case that's true. But we assume if you can't speak and you can't hear, right? There's no way to learn. There's no way to understand information. So a chirish shenechlatz, chirish who has chalitza done, right? Who does chalitza? Sorry, well, has chalitza done to him, right? Because he's the object, I guess, or subject, right? Hachereshet shenechlatza, or a woman who's a chereshet, right? Who got married to a guy. The guy dies without children. She goes and does chalitza to his brother. Then, or chaletzet the katan, or if you do chalitza to a minor, so a boy, the brother of the deceased husband, who's 9 years old, you do chalitza to him, to a minor. In all those cases, chalitzata psula. Okay.
Can he get married in the first place?
It's a good question. You're saying how can a chareshet get married?
No, I'm wondering if they can. I mean, or a charesh that's a legally binding marriage. Or
it's a good question.
Okay, you don't have to know everything.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. The Gemara, so let's say the answer is yes, but there's technicalities, right? The question is how can you do it? But there are times, part of it relies on whether you can do it through an action. Right? You can not necessarily have words, but you can do bia, let's say, for example. Right? So there,
right.
But it is complicated because there's also cases where a person was not necessarily charesh when they got married, but became a charesh.
Well, let's just say, but in the beginning, yeah.
Right. But it is. But there are limitations. You can't necessarily do kesef. You can't necessarily do a kinyan the regular way you do a kinyan.
Right.
But a kinyan through bia would be okay, right? So, in most cases, obviously, unless it's forced. So in these cases, it's not chalitzato psula. Chalitzato is psula because basically they don't have dot. And so this is how we're understanding it now. And therefore, it's very tricky because Rashi points out, like, what does this person do, right? Let's say she is married to a guy, her husband dies, and his only surviving brother is deaf, right? So what do you do in that case, right? It's really tricky. So of course you can always do yibum, right? But maybe always do yibum. Because even if you can't, so this is speaking to the same thing, even if he can't have dot to do chalitza, right? He can do dot, he can do the act of bia, and the act of bia is komer no matter what. Of course, if she doesn't want to marry him, that's a different problem, right? So, but anyways, but that's the way you could do it. It's a very interesting. Rashi says, and this is very tricky. Rashi says, well, if you have nothing else to do, you do yibum, and then if he wants, you can do a get. But it gets a little tricky also, right? So, how
exactly? That's not to give a get, doesn't it?
Right. How you do get if he's a chirush. Anyways, we'll get to get, and we'll discuss how to do get in these tricky situations. But continues the Mishnah, kitana shechotza. If you have a kitana who does chalitza, right? So she's not mature, she's 10 or whatever, and she's married. You can be married when you're a minor. Then her husband dies, and she goes and does chalitza to the brother. Says the Mishnah, tachlotz mishatigdal. She should do chalitza again when she gets older, when she's above 12. Im lo chalitza, and if she doesn't, chalitza to psula. Of course, the Gemara is going to ask. It doesn't make any sense. So why don't you say, you got to do chalitza again? It doesn't work. So why do we give this sort of specific detail? Chalitza b'shnayim or b'shlosha. Now let's say you do chalitza in front of 2 or 3 dayamim. But then it turns out that one of them, right? Echam karov l'pasul is a relative to the other, or to you, or it's pasul. It says the Mishnah chalitza to psula. The actual chalitza is pasul. We quoted this earlier today. And Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yochanan, Sander machshir. But Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yochanan, Sander said that was okay. And maaseh be'achad shechalatz beino leveina. There was once a story, as we said, difficult story, where a person was choletz between him and her, bebeit asurim, in jail, prison. Rabbi Akiva said, I guess b'diavad, that's okay for chalitza. Now, Amar Rav. Rav said something very fascinating. Hashta da'amr kri'alo ma'ak. Remember, everyone in our Mishnah said that the reading of the words is not ma'akev, the chalitza, right? As long as you do take off the shoe and you do the spitting, that's okay. There was a machloket whether actually the spitting was ma'akev or just the shoe. But everybody seemed to agree in our Mishnah that the reading of the parts does not ma'akev. So says Rava, Hashta da'amr kri'alo ma'akfa. Now that we've said that reading the words is not ma'akev the chalitza, the fikach, Ilaim v'ilemet shechotzu chalitzatan kshera. A person who is ilaim and ilamet, the person who cannot speak, right, and she's ilamet, right, so they can't say the words, not deaf, right, but they're ilaim, chotzu chalitzatan kshera. They are kosher. Now, this is Gemara. One second. Now, let's go back and read our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said, cheresh shenechlatz. Sorry, this is not our Mishnah, right? This is another. We'll see this later. Another break. If you have a deaf person who does chalitza, or a chareshet, a woman who's deaf, shechotza, right? Sorry, this is our Mishnah. And someone who does chalitza from a minor, the boy is a minor, chalitza to psula, the chalitza is pasol. I don't understand. My time. La mishum lavnei kriyanin. It says in our Mishnah, remember, that you don't need to do the kriya. So why is it that a deaf person can't do chalitza? So we're assuming it's because, no, we're going to change this assumption, but we're assuming it's because they can't read. They're illiterate, right? Because they don't know, they are deaf. And like I said, many times people are deaf, especially in those times without new educational tools. They can't learn to read. So it implies that it's because they can't read. Now, how could you say that someone who's mute, who obviously can't speak, is able to do chalitza because the kriya is not makev? Our Mishnah said that if you're deaf, and we're assuming deaf is because you can't read, is not chalitza. So that's a contradiction, right? My time alav mishum delav b'nei kriya niku. We're no, lo mishum delav b'nei deyanim. It's because they are not able to be intelligent enough. They don't understand what's going on. They can't hear. They never learn. They don't understand what's going on in the world. They never got that education. And so just like a minor is puzzle because they're considered not to have dat, so too is it chirish. Well, what about a mute person? A mute person also doesn't able to speak, so you have no idea what's going on inside of them. That's ridiculous. What are you talking about? People who are mute, their brains are fun. They hear everything, they understand. It's a funny terminology, right? Their lips hurt them. I mean, there's a communication issue. There's some brain issue, whatever it is. It doesn't affect their knowledge. They definitely understand, right? And of course, we've had many cases, and we had this famous case before. Rashi quotes it here. Remember that there was students who never said anything, who didn't know how to speak, and then one day, I think Rav maybe prayed for them, and they were able to speak again, and they knew all the Gemara, and they understood everything. In any event, you tell very different things. So being deaf, again, in those days, really meant that you had no insight. You couldn't hear anyone. You couldn't understand anything. But being mute didn't mean that at all. You can hear everything. You understand. Your brain's working fine. You just can't communicate. Just can't speak. So that's okay. Ask the Gemara. Well, what about Amri de Rabbi Yanai Lefishaino v'Amar v'Amra? Rabbi Yanai said, right, that the reason that a chirish in our Mishnah is not kosher is because the Torah says Amar, that he says Amra, and she says, right, and they can't speak because a chirish, like I said, means they can't hear and they can't speak. So if it's dependent on speech, then an elaim, a mute person, should also not be able to do chalitza. Ella says, Amar, you're right. Hietmar de Rava, when Rava said that a elaim elaim are okay, it was a seifa. It was on the second part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, right, let's read it, opposite, chirish shenechlatz v'chareshet shechotza, a chirish who does chalitza, or meaning they take off the shoe and they spit, right, or she spits, but he's a chirish, or a chareshet shechotza, or a woman who's chareshet, or choletzet min hakatan. The Mishnah said chalitza to psula. All these cases, the chalitza is pasul, and that's where Rava said the opposite. Hashta the amrit kriya me'akfa. Since we're saying that a deaf, mute person cannot do chalitza because you have to read the words, Lefikach Elaim v'Ilemet shecholtzu chalitzatam psula. In fact, and Elaim is the opposite, is possible. Because our Mishnah seems to support and say that the reason for chalitza specifically is that you have to be able to read. And since a mute person cannot read by definition, and a deaf person we describe also someone who can't read, they cannot do chalitza. Okay? Umatniten dirikirib zera. In fact, in our Mishnah will be telling us the principle, the very famous and beautiful principle of Rabbi Zera. You see here on the left, this is quoted around 15 times in Shas, like that, but very, very large number of times, which is the fascinating rule that, remember, the Torah says you should do the reading, right? Our Mishnah holds, according to everybody, that the reading is not ma'akev, and that if a woman does chalitza with a man without doing the reading, she is free. That's good chalitza, right? Everybody agrees with that. However, if a person cannot speak and therefore they can't do the reading, they can't do chalitza, right? So there's a contradiction. If you can't do it, then it's ma'akev, and if you can do it and you don't do it, it's not a problem.
So you have to have the ability to do it.
So that's that is the principle that we're about to quote of Rabbi Zera. Amar Rabbi Zera, kol hara'oi lebila ein bila ma'akevet. Anything that could be mixed, mixing is not necessary. Kol she'ein ra'oi lebila bila ma'akevet. And if you can't mix it, then you need to mix it. What is that? What's the case? Remember, we've quoted this many, many times. Rashi here, I think, goes through it somewhere. Maybe not even. He assumes you know it. The case is about a mincha. Remember, a mincha is flour and oil, right? And the Torah says you mix it together. The Gemara paskins very clearly that you don't need to mix it well. If you do a poor job of mixing the mincha and all the oils on one side and all the flours on the other side, it's still a kosher mincha. Maybe not ideal, but b'diavad it's definitely kosher. However, the Gemara, the Mishnah learns that if you have, remember there was a certain size of the pot in the Beit HaMikdash. If you give more than 60 sa'ah of flour for your mincha, you donate 5 sacks of flour as a mincha. The Mishnah says you have to put it in 2 different pots, because if you put it all in one pot, there's not enough room to mix comfortably, right? You have to have a little bit extra space. As everyone knows, is mixed, right? If it's too full, it ends up getting on the sides or falling over, and you don't mix it well. So we say if it's above 60 sa'ah flour, you have to put it into 2 pots. If you put it in one, it's not kosher. If you put 61 sa'ah and oil, it would be a pasul mincha. So we ask the same question. What do you mean? So what if you can't mix it well, right? You don't need to mix the mincha b'diavad. It's kosher even if you don't mix it. And that's where Rabbi Yanai says his principle, very important principle, not Rabbi Zera, sorry, that it's true that you don't need to mix it. You have to be able to mix it. So if it's ra'oi lebila, if it's in a size bowl that you could mix it, then if you don't mix it, it's okay. Ein bila ma'akev. But if it's eino ra'oi lebila, if you can't even do the thing, then it's ma'akev. And the same thing is true about the reading. Reading is a critical part of chalitza, the ceremony. It's not ma'akev. It's an important part, but it's not something that if you don't do, you can't continue. It counts. However, if you're not capable of speaking, because you're mute, deaf, mute, then, or a child maybe, then the speaking is ma'akev, and the fact that you can't do amar v'amra means that it's not a chalitza. And that's the understanding of our Mishnah.
Isn't that kind of counterintuitive?
In what way?
Well, if you could do it and didn't, why didn't you do it? And if you can't do it, then you should be excused from doing it.
Right. I mean, you could say that. Obviously, it's not. This is a whole discussion of Rabbi Zera, but the sort of the logic behind Rabbi Zera is that not as long as you have the potential to do it, you're sort of it has the future potential, right? It has the potential energy of a mixed mincha. If you couldn't even accomplish it, then you don't even have that potential. But this is a very important point, and we talk about it all the time, of course, about things that are not ma'akev. But should you not be even able to do it, then it is ma'akev.
What would be another example of that, if you don't mind?
So I mean, we talk about this by an example by like different mitzvot where you don't need a shear for the mitzvah, right? Like a minimum shear, but then you can't be yotze and say a lulav. Because we had a machloket, I think in Sukkah we used this where there's a machloket whether an etrog needs a certain shear, right?
Okay.
So there's a machloket, but some opinions hold that you don't. There's no shear for an etrog. It can be as small as you have. However, the Gemara said that if it's an etrog that's say avodah zarah or something you have to destroy, then it's not kosher, right? So why not if you don't need a shear? And so we applied the same kind of idea. that if you don't necessarily need a shear, but you need to have a potential for a shear. But if you don't even have it, right, if it's not even exists, then it would be something that would be outside of the realm of anything that even exists. That's one example. There's a whole bunch of other examples about truma and maaser, which is usually where you bring this in. So pay attention. You keep going because you see here on the left. This is quoted here in Kedushin, Nidarim, Baba Batra, Makot, Chulin, Menachon, Nida.
Where are you looking?
Misor Hashas. Do you have Misor Hashas?
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, I see it. Yeah.
So, anyways, we're coming up to a few other good cases. We're going to talk about this concept. Of course, it starts in Menachot when it talks about the mincha, but we have many, many places. Sholchulei lavud d'shmo. Now, they sent a message, and they sent a question, I would say, to lavud d'shmo, and they asked Yevamot shirakika tichlotz. Right? They sent this message basically that a Yevamot who spit to a in front of her Yevamot, right? Let's say so the case is where a woman was married to a guy, the guy died. She then, without not in the context of a chalitza ceremony, she spits at the brothers, or at least one of the brothers. Just does chalitza. She's angry.
And any of them?
Any of them. Well, yeah, because you could do chalitza to any of the brothers, right?
Right, but
she spits at one of them. She doesn't. They sent her avoid the shmol tachlotz. She should in fact do chalitza, meaning she can no longer do yibum. But once she has spit in front of them, it's as if she partly did chalitza or started the process of chalitza, and therefore she can't do yibum after that spitting. Says the Gemara Mechlal. That implies that it passes her from the brothers. When she can no longer, once you spit to a potential Yevamot, you can no longer do yibum, money. Now, who is that? Ilema Rabbi Akiva. If it's Rabbi Akiva, hashka. Now, according to Rabbi Akiva, ma b'makom mitzvah. In the time that you're doing the mitzvah, meaning when you're actually doing chalitza, and you do the take off the shoe, and you read the thing, and Rabbi Akiva says in our Mishnah that if you don't spit, it's okay. It's not ma'akev, right? You might think that it's like the emurim, right? Remember that this is a very similar concept. Right? So generally, when you bring a karban on the mizbeach, you're only allowed to eat the meat if you've burned the parts properly. Okay? Until you've burned the parts, you can't eat the meat. Burning the parts is what matters the meat, right? However, if you lost the parts or they became tamei, they were thrown out, let's say, you can still eat the meat. So the emurim are only ma'akev if they exist. If they don't exist, they're not ma'akev. Meaning the principle is don't eat the meat until you burn the emurim, right? Because that's what goes to Hashem, that's what goes to the mizbeach. But that only is true if there are emurim. So by emurim, I'll read the words again. Dechi itnu. Where am I? If they don't exist, I mean, they're, for whatever reason, they're thrown out, they're lost, they're not ma'akev the karban, or eating the karban. But then when they do exist ma'akev, they are ma'akev. So you might say something about similar to spitting, right? That during the act of yibah, of chalitza, you have to spit, right? But during the non-act of chalitza, you're just angry she's angry at her brothers-in-law, right? There's no mitzvah to spit. So Rabbi Akiva still says that during the act of chalitza, if you don't spit, it's still a chalitza, right? So certainly not in the act of the Maaser Chalitza, it should not be Ma'akev, right? So that's our logic. Rabbi Akiva lo Ma'akfa, so Me'achim Nifsala. Would you then say it's an act to pass off from the brothers? Meaning, we seem to think, again, we're going to question this, that in Rabbi Akiva, the act of spitting is not so important part of the Chalitza. And even when she's doing the ceremony, if she doesn't spit, it's not Ma'akev. So certainly not during the ceremony. If she spits, it shouldn't make it into part of a chalitza. It shouldn't pass along on the brothers. Ella must be the Rebbe Elazar. It must be like Rebbe Elazar. Rebbe Elazar says that spitting is ma'akev. And if you don't spit, then you're not doing chalitza, which means the spitting is a critical part of chalitza. And therefore, maybe Rebbe Elazar is saying that if you spit alone, then you're basically initiating or partially doing the mitzvah of chalitza, and postulating the woman to marry, to do yibam to any of the brothers. Okay? Says but that doesn't work in something else for Rabbi Elazar. But it is a example where you have two actions, in this case maybe three actions, but a minimum of two actions that allow an object to be mutar. In this case, allow the woman to go marry, right? What are the actions? Right? Sorry, the actions are chalitza and spitting and maybe reading as well, right? And the rule is, according to Rabbi Elazar, shnei dvarim hamatirim in malin zeh. When you have two actions that are needed, remember Rabbi Elazar says that they're ma'akev, that the taking off of the shoe and the spitting are ma'akev. And when you have two things, one doesn't work without the other. So the fact that this woman spit at her brothers-in-law shouldn't be chalitza. Ella says Rebbe. In fact, it's like Rebbe. Tanya Rebbe said kivsei atzeret. Right? This is a very interesting case as well. You remember we just had this, right? You have the kvasim that are brought on Shavuot, right? And remember, you bring with them the shtei halechem, right? Says the Braita, kivsei atzeret ein mikadshim halechem. They don't make the lechem kodesh for the mizbeach, for kachim. Ella b'shchita. They only become kodesh when you shecht the carbon. So once you shecht the kivsei atzeret, the lechem that were brought with it become kodesh like part of that carbon. Ketzad says the Mishnah, the Braita. How is that? Shachtan l'shman. Let's say you shecht the shlamim for the right purpose, and you're zarek daman l'shman. You sprinkle the blood for the right purpose. Then kidesh halechem. Then the lechem becomes kodesh. But let's say you're shachat shalol l'shman v'zarak l'shman. Let's say you only do part of it the right way. Shech the shlamim for the wrong purpose, and you sprinkle on the blood for the right purpose. Or says the Braita, lo kidesh halechem. Then the lechem is not kodesh because you did the shechita inappropriately. Let's say you do the opposite. You're shachtan l'shman. You shech the shlamim for the right purpose, the right name. V'zarak daman shalol l'shman. But then you sprinkle the blood without the right intention. Says the Braita, kadosh ne'eno kadosh, Divrei Rebbe. Rebbe says it's kodesh but not kodesh, meaning you did it somewhat but not completely, and so you have to act as if it's kodesh, but you can't treat it like it's kodesh. And the same thing would presumably be true about this woman, that she basically did part of the chalitza by spitting, and so she is partly chalutz, but not totally, and so she can't marry the brothers, but she has to finish the action. In the Braita, Rabbi Elazar, Reb Shimon Omer, L'olam eino kadosh ad sheyishchot l'shmam yizrok daman shelo l'shmam. It has to be, both things have to be done. And so therefore our Mishnah, or not our Mishnah, this halacha of a Yevamot who is rakika, that she should then only do chalitza and cannot do yibam anymore, is going according to Rebbe, who says that even if you do part of an action that's needed, a two-part action, doing one part already starts the kedusha or the effect of the action, and therefore limits you from being able to do yibam afterwards. Okay, let's continue.
So it doesn't matter in what order it's being done at that point. It's just the fact that she did it. It ties her to chalitza only.
Correct.
And then, so there's no order for the rest?
There is, well then, no, then you would follow from there and try, I guess you would try to follow the right order after that, say the right thing and do the shul. But the order is not makim. Rashi does point out, just to add to this a little bit, Rashi points out that when you say rakika, it has to be the fnei beit din. If she just spits at them without a beit din, it wouldn't necessarily be possible. So I guess,
And what if there's edim, but not a bet din per se?
Wow.
It's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because the question is, remember, according to one opinion earlier, you don't need it.
Right.
You do it
you definitely need at least a judge, right? You need to say that. Well, not necessarily. I take it back. Remember, they did a beit no levein not. I think the point about spitting in front of beit din is not just that you need the beit din. It's that not every time a person spits is a part of an action that would be considered part of chalitza. But clearly, according to Avuah Deshmuel, you got to be very careful, right? You got to separate maybe and be conscious of this possibility. Ask the Gemara now, 2 lines in the bottom. Let's do a little more because we have some time. Well, Rabbi Akiva, so the Bach changes the gersa, not me Amar. But according to Rabbi Akiva, Rikika lo pasla. But you just said that our logic was that according to Rabbi Akiva, since spitting is not ma'akev, if you just spit, then it doesn't do enough to make her puzzle, right? That's our logic. And so it must be according to Rabbi Elazar. Ask him, is that true? Rabbi Akiva, Rikika lo pasla. If a Yevamot spits at the brother-in-law, does that not puzzle her to make it that they can no longer do yibam? Tanya, but the Braita says the following: Chotza v'lo rakika. Let's say you take off the shoe, but you don't spit, or v'lo kara, you don't move the word, right? Then chalitza tok shira, which sounds like Rabbi Akiva. Remember, Rabbi Akiva said that as long as you do chalitza, the other parts are not ma'akev. But continues the Braita, rakika v'lo chotza. Let's say you just spit, you don't take off the shoe, v'lo kara, chalitza tok psula. Okay, then the chalitza is psula. Now, well, let's finish the Braita. Well, before I finish the Braita, we assume that chalitza tok psula does not mean there's no chalitza. And the reason we assume that is the next words of the Braita are, it says kara. Let's say she just reads the words. V'lo rakika v'lo chalza. She doesn't do the rakika, she doesn't do chalitza of the shoe. Ein kan beit michush. There's nothing to worry about. So clearly in the Braita, there's three categories. There's chalitza kshira, right, which means she's done. There's chalitza psula, and there's ein kan beit michush, don't worry about anything. What's the middle ground, chalitza to psula? So we think what that means is that it's like a partial chalitza. It's like a get puzzle, right? Where she basically becomes puzzle on the rest of the brothers to do yibam. But she's not free to any other person because it's not a good chalitza, right? So the implication here is that it's Rabbi Akiva, we'll see in a second, and that the chalitza of spitting, and that the act of spitting does puzzle her on the brothers, right? Says Gemara money. Who is the Tana of this bride? Elam Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Eliezer, we say here, or Rabbi Elazar. Then how could the first part of the bride make any sense? How could it be if you do chalitza, but you don't spit and you don't read, that it's chalitza tok sheira? Rabbi Elazar said in our Mishnah, right, that you need to do the rikika in order for it to be a chalitza. Amar Rabbi Elazar, kacha yased davar shehu ma'aseh ma'akev. Any action, including spitting, is ma'akev. Ela pshita, it's Rabbi Akiva. It must be that the author of this brayta is Rabbi Akiva, who says that you don't need to spit, right? And that's why if you just do chalitza without spitting, without reading, chalitza is kshera, right? It must be Rabbi Akiva. But then the middle case katani was rakika v'lo chotza v'lo kara chalitza to psula. The chalitza is a pasul chalitza. Now, what does it mean? It's a pasul chalitza. The man. If you tell me it's a pasul chalitza and she can't go out and marry another man because she's still zakuk to the Yevamot, pshita, of course. Mi avi chalitza d'ishtari la'alma. Right? How could this kind of chalitza matter her to the world? Ella must be telling us la'achim. Right? It must be saying that she's pasul to the other brothers to do yiba. Because since she did rikika, that's the beginning of an action of chalitza, and she can no longer go back and do yiba. Shma mina. So you see from here that according to Rabbi Akiva, spitting alone would pasul her to the brothers. Okay? And I think we should stop here. No, you want to do two more lines? Three more lines? Let's do three more lines. Says the Gemara with Rabbi Akiva. So now, I don't understand why. Ma'ishna rikika, ma'ishna kriya. Why is it that according to Rabbi Akiva, if you remember, Rabbi Akiva says the only part that's ma'akev the chalitza is pulling off the shoe, right? If you pull off the shoe, then chalitza is over, even if you don't do the rest. But if you do the rest, it's not over. But for some reason, she just says the words, and he says the words, then it's as if he did nothing, and she can go marry, do yibam to the brothers. But if she spit, then you no longer can do yibam to the brothers, right? Even though chalitza is not done yet, it sort of started the action, and you no longer, she's puzzled to the brothers to do yibam, right? Ask the Gemara, why is that? Rabbi Akiva, ma'ishna rikika or ma'ishna kriya. Why is rikika, spinning, a beginning of an action that puzzles her to the brothers, but kriya does not? Why? Because kriya de'ita be'metchila be'mesof lo michlaf aleh. Kriya, which you do in the beginning and the end, right? You do kriya before and after. So then people who see the kriya will not say, oh, now she's done with her chalitza and she's able to, right, let's say she does the kriya and then she starts the chalitza and then she goes and marries the brother. Does yibam. People will look at that and will say, oh, a woman who did chalitza can then do yibam. That's our concern. But with kriya, we're not worried about that because people will recognize, oh, there's kriya in the beginning and the end, and she only did part of the kriya, so she didn't do chalitza, and that's why she was able to go marry the brothers, right? Lo michlaf aleh. Rikika, since rikika is supposed to be done after taking off the shoe, right? People who see her spit will think, I came late to the action. I didn't see the beginning of this action. I didn't see her take off his shoe, but she must have done it. Then she spit, and now the Chachamim are allowing her to go marry his brother. How could that be? It must be that you can marry your brother after chalitza, which of course is wrong. And so therefore they made a takana that if you've done the rikika, you should not allow her to do Yibam ever, and you have to go back and do a full chalitza. Okay? Good luck, everyone. Have a good
Thank
week.
you.
Miriam, enjoy the Holy Land.
Thank you. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Yeah.